Bene, aspettiamo qualche minuto prima di iniziare, aspettiamo che si colleghino un po' di persone. Bene, buonasera a tutti e benvenuti ad una nuova diretta con China Files. Io sono Gian Luca Atzori e oggi avremo con noi Ferchen, direttore della ricerca globale sulla Cina al MERICS di Berlino e grande esperto del rapporto Cina e Stati Uniti. Questa diretta segue infatti la pubblicazione dell'ultimo ebook mensile pubblicato sul nostro sito a tema Cina-USA, completamente dedicato quindi al rapporto tra queste superpotenze. È accessibile tramite una piccola sottoscrizione. In attesa che il nostro ospite ci raggiunga, lo sto invitando in questo momento, eccolo qui. L'intervista di oggi sarà totalmente in inglese, che c'è la possibilità per gli spettatori di porre domande all'interno della chat, che qualora avanzasse del tempo proveremo a vedere insieme alla fine del discorso. Ecco Matt. Hi Matt.
Hi Luca.
Welcome to China Files.
Thanks. Good to see you here today.
Can you hear me? Good.
I can. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good.
Let's begin then. Just give me a minute to introduce you to our audience. Welcome everyone to a new live talk with China Files. My name is Gian Luca Atzori and I'm here today with Ferchen, Head of Global Research on China at MERICS, the Mercator Institutes for China Studies in Berlin. Ferchen's research focuses on China economic statecraft, China's Belt and Road Initiative as a part of China developing country relations with Southeast Asia, Latin America and Africa, and on US-China relations. He specializes in connections between China's domestic and foreign political economy, the governance of China's informal economy, and the relationship between economic development and security in China's foreign policy. From 2008 to 2017, Ferchen was a faculty member in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University, where we met the first time. And then from 2011 to 2019, he was a scholar with the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. So, Matt, your last paper is called Towards Extreme Competition, Mapping the Contours of US-China Relations under the Biden administration. In recent years, with the advent of Trump, we have witnessed a progressive deterioration in the relationship between the US and China. A trade war began, and which led to the Huawei arrest case in Canada, and which, according to recent reports, cost the US up to 245,000 jobs. Today, there are those who talk about the new Cold War or a tech war. There are those who are speculating about the origins of the virus, the decoupling, the security dilemma, and those who have gone further by hypothesizing a conflict. With the advent of Biden, however, the approach has changed. But in any case, tensions are still evident. So what really changed between Trump and Biden? How do you think the China-US relation will evolve?
Great. Well, it's great to be here with you and to see you, and thanks for inviting me on. So yeah, big questions. Obviously, since we last knew each other in China in a classroom, back 5 years ago or so, the world of US-China relations has changed, and obviously Europe-China relations have also changed quite a bit. And I think a lot of that certainly goes back to changes that the Trump administration made, some of which were already in process, but certainly the Trump administration initiated a variety of changes in the China U.S. relationship, which the Biden administration has inherited. So I think one of the questions that we all need to grapple with is, well, what happened? What happened in the U.S.-China relationship? What is it that the Trump administration was doing, and then how does that relate to what the Biden administration is attempting to do? I think we're going to be dealing with this, and historians are going to be trying to understand this for quite some time. But for sure, what the Trump administration did was tap into a number of grievances that had existed for quite some time, frustrations in different communities in the US. One of those would be the business community. So concerns about market access, about intellectual property, about forced transfer, including technology transfer. So all of that was, existing when the Trump administration came in 2017. And I think that also provides a lot of the explanation for the trade war. Obviously, things deteriorated even more when the Corona crisis happened, and obviously started in China and emanated around the world from there, and that caused a deterioration even further in the U.S.-China relationship. So the Biden administration inherited a vastly different scenario in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. Things had certainly were not on a good footing. And there were a lot of questions about what components of that relationship that the Trump administration, or policies the Trump administration had put in place, that the Biden team would keep or change. And I can just say a few thoughts on that, and any other questions you have on that we can discuss. But I think there are at least three areas where we can detect some change. First is the tone. The Trump administration, especially on its way out in January of this year, for example, was making a concerted push to explain to the American people, but also to people around the world, that one of the accomplishments of the Trump administration was to explain that China was an existential threat to the American people and to people around the world, so that there was something major that needed to be confronted in terms of the essence of what China had become. And that needed to be confronted, if not turned back. So this is something the Biden administration has not picked up exactly in the same way. It has not referred to China necessarily as an existential threat, but as one that needs a different kind of competitive response from the United States. Part of that competitive response is working with allies. So that includes in Europe and Asia, including on more values-based topics, including the quality of democracy, and the idea that democracies, rules-based, law-based societies need to work together to confront some of the concerns the U.S. And European countries and some in Asia have with China. And then the third one, which is probably the biggest or most dramatic change, is just climate. Clearly, the Trump administration pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. Basically, were climate deniers, climate change deniers. The Democratic Party and the Biden administration just have always had a different approach to this. And obviously, John Kerry is doing a lot of diplomatic work with China on climate and with Europe as well. So the climate component in terms of potential for cooperation, or the necessity of cooperation in some way with China, that's really a dramatic shift. But in a lot of other areas, I think we've seen less dramatic change between the Trump and Biden administrations than some people may have predicted, including maybe even me.
That's really interesting. In fact, as you wrote, the administration will need to choose between a punitive and a constructive approach on trade. So, as well as forging new narratives in this context, there's a kind of shift of focus from economic war to ideological competition. For example, the US are condemning China over abuses on human rights in the Xinjiang province and in Hong Kong, while Chinese government published an official document about the violation of human rights in the US. The report opened with the words of George Floyd, "I can't breathe." China has also condemned the tragic situation in the Mediterranean Sea and the military intervention implemented by NATO that has been pointed out as abuses on human rights. So is the narrative on human rights losing its diplomatic effect, or how can we decode this particular time in order not to be a prey to propaganda?
Yeah, well, certainly the human rights element of China's relationship with many regions, including the United States and Europe, has clearly come back into focus, as well as the sort of the propaganda efforts and concerns about that really also came into play as a result of some of China's COVID-related and medical responses in Europe and elsewhere last year. I think that one of the things that we need to do is keep in mind that this back and forth about human rights is something that has existed since at least the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. So, and it's not just the PRC. In fact, the Soviet Union were experts at this well before that even. So if you look back at some of the new literature on the Cold War, you'll see some interesting streams of consistency here about the back and forth. So the United States would blame the Soviet Union and China of oppressive, totalitarian kinds of activities, going back to, again, the founding of the PRC, and in response, the Soviet Union and China would talk about all of the problems in the United States, including the history of racism that is tied into the history of slavery, or in the European context, the concerns about colonialism or imperialist past, including in Asia. So this has been around for at least 70 years or so in terms of the PRC's approach whenever it is pushed on human rights issues. And there's a consistency here, at least in the case of the United States and China, when the United States blames China for, so going back to Tiananmen Square, for example, then China will push back and said, yes, but you lock up more of your people up than any country in the world, and you have ongoing problems with race relations and inequality and on and on. So that's one element of this. But certainly in terms of the Biden administration's approach in the US, I think there is a sense that, yes, there is a problem with the quality of American democracy represented by Trump and what happened on January 6th. And you see this being battled over, including here in my home state of Wyoming with Liz Cheney. There's a battle going on in the United States about the content and quality of democracy. And the Biden administration, I think, recognizes that this is a concern that needs to be addressed, and that by improving the quality of democracy and working with other democracies and not denigrating America's allies, again, in Europe or Asia, that the U.S. can speak more loudly. The bigger question here in a lot of ways is, what can the U.S. or Europe do in practical sense to change things either in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong or on any other concern about human rights in China? And one of those is speaking consistently, which is certainly different from what the Trump administration did or what Europe was able to do with the United States during the Trump administration. But there's still big question marks about what anyone can really do to change things within China. But certainly speaking loudly and consistently about these concerns is something that's already happening.
Yeah, that's the main point. I think there is a problem with European democracy too in this moment. So in a similar situation and after a pandemic crisis, how is the Belt and Road initiatives or the new Silk Road project that had to change the geopolitical situation of China, how this project is changing in response to a completely different scenario? How the US and the EU are deciding to face China, and what do you think is the future of the Atlantic Alliance?
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot in there on So a few words on the Belt and Road Initiative. I think for the last couple of years, we'd already started to see a bit of a slowdown in at least some of the types of investment and financing that China had been doing, even going back to 2015 or so. And there are complex reasons for this, but there has been a shift, including in some of the work that I do on China and Latin America. There's been a decrease in China policy bank lending, which had been in the tens or 20 billions of dollars in any given year in the last decade. That really started to slow down around 2015 or 2016. Some of China's investment activities linked to the Belt and Road, but just in general, including in Europe, started to slow down in the last few years. And there are domestic reasons for that within China, but also concerns that countries, say in Europe or the United States, had about Chinese investments, and that slowed things down in terms of the review process. That said, there has continued to be Chinese investment, different flows of capital and people and business projects, especially into developing countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and those countries that are sort of the heart of the Belt and Road. So there's no way that China is giving up at all on its developing country diplomacy, which I think is really at the heart of the BRI. And if anything, China is pushing on this even more strongly as a result of tensions with the United States and Europe. So China is trying to shore up trusted relationships with countries, especially in the developing world, economic and diplomatic. What that means then for the US and Europe in terms of responses to the BRI, I think we see this happening slowly. Europe has its connectivity strategy for Europe and Asia, which has been around for a few years now. A lot of frustration about how that's progressing, but in a way, that's a European response to the BRI. The United States is playing around, at least in the Trump administration had already started this. The Blue Dot Network, high quality infrastructure strategy with Japan. Europe has also got some cooperation with Japan on high quality infrastructure. A lot of that is about standards. The big question is, will the US and Europe or other countries in Asia step up with real money? And that's unclear.
That's a really good point. And let's try to focus then on China neighbors in this context. During the Trump administration, we saw the US partially withdraw from the international arena, while China was enforcing its international presence, increasing its impact on all of Southeast Asia. How is the situation in the South China Sea evolving? And how are China neighbors reading the evolution of US-China relations?
Yeah, I think there's certainly different parts of Asia and different neighbors that we can talk about. Obviously, the South China Sea issue has continued to be one of the biggest concerns in terms of security risks and the potential for conflict, especially between the United States and China. Long-standing concerns that have gone back well before the deterioration in the relationship that happened under the Trump administration. One of the big question marks there is Taiwan, whether or not there will be a change in the status quo of Taiwan. Will the United States change the nature of its support, either sort of indicating greater support for Taiwan independence? Will China move in the direction of threats to take Taiwan back to the mainland? So a lot of speculation and concern about that. That's not a new issue. It's changed in some of its details. It's always one of, if not the most sensitive issue in terms of security concerns there, and the South China Sea and freedom of navigation operations continue to be a point of contestation, and who's going to cooperate, including European countries as part of the new Indo-Pacific strategies. Some European countries have committed naval ships to cooperating in some of these freedom of navigation operations with the United States and otherwise. So there are these traditional security concerns in the neighborhood in the South China Sea and Taiwan. But then if we look, for example, at Southeast Asia and ASEAN, there is a real concern that the deterioration in the US-China relationship is basically going to affect them negatively. They don't want to be caught in between. They already are. There are some upsides to this. Sometimes you can do some bargaining in terms of BRI kinds of things, investment in infrastructure, financing for infrastructure. We've already seen some of this play out as Japan, the United States, and maybe now Europe become more active players in providing alternative sources of funding for BRI kinds of activities, in infrastructure for transport or energy or digital. We potentially see some bargaining room for countries in the region. But you've seen, for example, Singaporean foreign policy leaders clearly state that they want the United States and China to basically calm down and not to involve the region in their conflict, and that the last thing they want to see is a real conflict.
And do you think it is possible to not get involved?
Oh, you mean for countries in the region to basically stay to balance this out? I mean, I think that's the everyday trick. China is right there, and China is in many ways the major trade partner, depending on investment and finance. It's a different picture. This is something really that the European Union is emphasizing with the Indo-Pacific strategy, is that Europe is a major trade and investment partner already in the region. I think there was a wake-up call last year when the RCEP agreement was signed. Europe, the EU wants to ensure that free trade agreements between the EU and countries in ASEAN and elsewhere in Asia continue to go through to shore up those kinds of trade agreements. So I do think there is some bargaining room, especially as economic vitality remains strong in the region. There's lots of discussion about supply chains and the need to make those more resilient, and Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia play an important role in that. So there's a lot of discussion about how that should play out in the region, and there's some room, depending on which countries we're talking about, for countries to tap into that. But it's really difficult because China is right there, and the United States is not going away either.
And what about China, the US neighbors then? From 2005 to 2019, China invested more than $150 billion in Latin America, involving 18 states in the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, China is the first trade partner of Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Peru, and Argentina. However, 9 of 15 countries that nowadays still recognize the independence of Taiwan are in Latin America. So what is the key role of Chinese investment in South America and their consequences in this relation with the US? And also,
yeah, this is so China's presence in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America and the Caribbean, really began to build about 2 decades ago. So this is not entirely new at all. There was a commodity boom from around 2003 to 2013 that really propelled trade relations, especially exports of raw materials like iron ore, and soy products, and energy products, especially oil, from South America to China. That period ended, at least the boom period ended around 2013 to 2014, and that had a pretty big impact on a lot of those exporting countries, maybe most obviously Venezuela, which is so dependent on oil and oil exports and deals with China. So what's interesting about this then is that, in a way, the momentum of a type had gone out of that China-Latin America relationship 7-8 years ago already. But then, especially under the Trump administration, there began to be a more concerted pushback from the United States, saying that a variety of China's activities in Latin America, but also regions like Africa, were bad for the region, bad for those regions, and bad for U.S. interests there. The U.S. started to consistently say that China was practicing predatory economics. The idea of debt trap diplomacy really was all tied up into that. At least in the Americas, Venezuela or Ecuador are probably the two most obvious examples of cases where there are large debt burdens, which are proving to be very difficult to sustain or harmful for all sides. So the Trump administration really started to push back on this. We have yet to see where the Biden administration is going to go. Right in the last days of the Trump administration, the U.S. did a deal with Ecuador to basically swap out Chinese loans for American loans, and in response, Ecuador needed to promise not to use Huawei in its 5G systems. It's unclear whether or not the Biden administration is going to look at that kind of deal making as a template in the region, or not. But clearly, the tone has still changed. I think there are concerns in the Biden administration still. As much as anything, the Biden administration needs to protect itself from Republican congressional criticism of weakness. So this is going to limit the room, including Latino policy makers in U.S. Congress. Marco Rubio, for example, is one of the people who pushes back on the need for the Trump administration, or for the Biden administration, to continue to be strong and vigilant, including in the Americas. So this is going to constrain what the Biden administration can do. That said, I think they're going to push for more active policies, especially related to alternative energy in the Caribbean, maybe in Central America. And we'll see if anything changes, if there can be more engagement to try to find a more productive solution for the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. Okay,
so in this context, what about the BRICS? I mean, the interest of this group of countries like Brazil, Russia, India, or South Africa. I mean, that cooperated with China for a long time, are still cooperating with China, but we are not like hearing about the situation so often like in the past. So what do you think is changing in this group of countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because when I was teaching at Tsinghua, I had so many students who did a BRIC related thesis, and it was kind of the flavor of the day. And now it's not that it's gone, but certainly the world has changed, and it's not like it was that long ago that BRICS was more of a hot topic. But this actually, I look at this, at least in the Latin American context, as having something to do with that commodity boom and bust that I talked about before. So if you think about sort of BRICS heyday, which I think was really in the years after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, that corresponded with the top of the commodity boom. So Brazil was doing well at that point. Lula was speaking up quite loudly in terms of Brazilian foreign policy, and BRICS was part of that. So the Brazilian economy was doing better. Lula was on the top of his game. He was sort of transforming Brazilian foreign policy. There was a kind of openness to engaging with China on that agenda. Again, also in the wake of the financial crisis, saying, look, this was a US European phenomenon. The US and Europe had been telling us, the developing countries or emerging markets, what to do for so long, and this obviously includes China as well. We don't want to hear it from you anymore. And that was part of the momentum behind BRICS, and that's just so obviously changed. Brazil has been in a long-term crisis economically and politically with the massive corruption scandals over the last few years. And that just makes it hard for Brazil to participate in the same way that it did during the heyday of that relationship. And then if you look at the other countries, India-China relations have deteriorated in various ways over the last few years. Indian economic growth has also stalled the sort of excitement about India's own economic reforms. Russia, China have continued to deepen their ties in various ways. So certain pairings and on certain issues have continued to maintain their momentum. But that whole grouping of 4 or then 5 countries has kind of lost its coherence. That said, they're continuing on with BRICS meetings and BRICS Bank, but it seems to me that the sort of excitement and momentum about BRICS really corresponded with a different period in time when those countries were doing better economically, and that there was a more cohesion, and they could all sort of respond to that together to the financial crisis, and that's just not how things are playing out now. But if you look at the sort of COVID-related elements of this, you now see competition. So the vaccine diplomacy, in a way, that's sort of resonant of this, of like, okay, there's a crisis. Who's going to be whose friend? Who's going to come to the rescue with real means? And we see this with vaccine diplomacy. China's obviously playing this game. Russia is, and the United States is coming around as well. So I see that as part of a broader competition between China and the United States, and Europe also, for hearts and minds in the developing world.
Yeah, there is also a question about this topic from the audience. So I can ask you in this moment, because but before, I remind the audience that you can ask questions in the chat, and we have the first question from Fabrizia. Fabrizia asks you, did China really fill the financial vacuum of the US in Latin America? And also, how impactful has been the Chinese vaccine diplomacy in the area?
Yeah, great questions. My sense is that there was some filling of a vacuum, or maybe it wasn't even just necessarily a vacuum. It was clear that, especially for commodities, there was space for South American economies to ramp up production, for example, of soy, for the Chinese market. In that sense, the U.S. and China compete. U.S. and Brazil compete for the soy production and exports to China. So China didn't necessarily fill a vacuum in that sense. It's just that it changed patterns of production, including more directed exports of, for example, iron ore or soy products or copper. China was just the major source of demand for these. The U.S. wasn't necessarily going to be supplying all of those products. In the case of soy, yes, a little bit. In terms of a diplomatic void, the U.S. always goes back and forth. I mean, sometimes it pays attention to the region of the Caribbean, Central America, Latin, South America, and sometimes it ignores it, or sometimes it actively contributes to instability in the region, including through drug war kinds of policies. But there are times when the U.S. more or less just ignores the region as well. And I think that when China came in the early 2000s, the United States had obviously turned its attention to Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. Just not a lot of focus on the Americas. George Bush had said he was going to pay more attention. He had ties to Mexico and former governor of Texas. And in that sense, I think that there was a lot of goodwill in much of Latin America, that there was an alternative trade partner. And to a certain extent, and among a certain set of countries in the region, that China was also a welcome diplomatic partner, including as a socialist country. So you saw left-leaning governments in the region, Chavez in Venezuela, leading the ALBA group, but also Lula. Sort of there was a willingness to really play up the South-South dimensions of the China-Latin America relationship, especially during that boom period that I mentioned. So I'm not sure that's all necessarily a vacuum, but it shows that there was room and a sort of receptivity to China as a trade and diplomatic partner in the region. Sorry, there was a second part of that. I think I missed it.
The second part of the question?
Yeah.
You mean, how impactful has been the vaccine diplomacy in the area?
Oh, right. Yeah. So that one I don't really have a good answer for. I know there's some good work being done on this by some Chilean and other scholars because some of the focus has been on Chile, where there's been a lot of people there vaccinated with Chinese vaccines. I still think this is playing out because it's unclear, first of all, how effective the Chinese vaccines are going to be. You see this back and forth, even in a place where, like Brazil, where there has been active China-Brazil cooperation with Chinese vaccines. The situation is obviously very difficult, and Bolsonaro has been one of the people most criticized for his response to the crisis. Obviously, a lot of people who've died in the region. So it makes it difficult in that sense for China to necessarily claim success. And I think we're just going to have to see how that plays out still. Again, I think there is likely goodwill, at least at the government level, less clear in terms of public reactions, to just the fact that China is showing itself to have tried and to have cared at a time when the US or the European Union or the UK were so inward looking in terms of trying to deal with the crisis themselves.
Yeah, that's clear. So Fabrizia, thank you a lot for your replies. And
Great.
And I'm also thank you because it's difficult to face such a complexity. I mean, it's a situation that is still evolving and is changing rapidly, and during a pandemic crisis. So it's the first time maybe these countries or the world are seeing this situation. The last pandemic was 100 years ago, so it's a completely different scenario, as you say. And now I have a little higher nerdy question for you.
All right, good.
In international relation theory, we mainly refer to three schools of thought. What kind of interpretation can we give to the actual US-China relation from a constructivist, a realist, and a liberal point of view?
Yeah, it's great. I haven't thought about it in a while, and I'm not sure I was the best person to be teaching international relations, because I always talked about how I'm no big fan of IR theories necessarily. That said, I think that there's actually some practical implications of these different theoretical approaches these days. So first of all, if we look at least in international political economy, the more liberal approaches had been dominant for quite some time. And I think this corresponded both with a sort of American hegemony, both in academic terms, but also geopolitically, but also with a period of globalization. It just, like, liberal arguments about why there were benefits to free trade and free flow of travel and finance, of rules-based international order or agreements like the WTO. All of that corresponded with a period of time that I think we see going away now. I think we fairly clearly see it going away, and I think that corresponded. It was probably well underway before the Trump administration, at least going back to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and skepticism about globalization around the world. But certainly, I think from the U.S. side of things, the Trump administration changed this dramatically, a skepticism about sort of liberal approaches, even political ones, about the value of democracy, but also of open trade, for example. So I think we see the dominant liberal paradigms, including those that we see in some sense in international relations theory. They're changing, and I think it helps to understand that was dominant and it's changing. If we look at realism, I see this is all over. This is really an important part of what's going on analytically or intellectually in terms of the criticism of China. Basically, an argument that China is playing a mercantilist game, that China, in terms of its domestic and foreign policy, aims not to, China talks about win-win, mutually beneficial relations all the time, but people are very skeptical of this in a realist way and say, no, China is trying to boost its power and influence using commercial aims sometimes. So very skeptical of those kinds of mutually beneficial win-win arguments, which are basically kind of liberal arguments. So criticisms that China, including through the Belt and Road, is trying to use its economic might to leverage its power on the global stage and its influence on the global stage. Those are very kind of economically realist kinds of arguments. We see others that are more traditional, just sort of power transition theories, the idea that China is the up-and-coming power, the US is the dominant power, there is potentially an inevitable conflict between those. This idea that China wants to usurp or take America's position of global dominance or hegemony. All of those very much fit and factor into US policy. I see them playing out in various ways in Europe as well. And then the last one is I think the constructivist one is just as important, because behind all of this are perceptions that governments trying to change perceptions actively, but also this idea in especially these realist ideas that I'm talking about. I think they're pretty far out in front. The idea that China can basically transfer its growing economic size into actual influence, including in Southeast Asia. I've been writing about this recently. It's not so easy as that. It's not that China doesn't have more means of influence, or that it isn't more central in terms of being a trade or investment partner. It absolutely is. But if we look at concerns that basically China has a plan with the Belt and Road, and it's going to situate itself clearly as the dominant power in Asia, and can basically then get what it wants from its neighbors or countries in, say, Africa or Latin America. It's just not happening that way as smoothly as all that. Not that it couldn't still. But then the question is, why are the perceptions of even in things like debt trap diplomacy, what's going on with that when it's so clear that analysts can debunk some of those actual situations? So what's going on with the politics of that conceptually and in terms of perceptions? I think there's a lot that sort of constructivist approaches can tell us about that as well.
That's true, but can we say that realist approach now is the more implemented one for facing this situation?
Yeah, so I wrote a paper for this University of Pennsylvania project on U.S.-China relations, and it's still up. It's still a working paper, because we're trying to work through some of the details of that and get policymakers to listen a little bit more. And I think one of the focuses that I have in there is that some of these realist ideas are sort of out in front of the reality on the ground, and it makes it difficult to determine the actual problems on the ground. So if you have a sort of simplistic argument, and this is, I basically say that this is not a very sophisticated form of realism. It's basically people with assumptions that China can effectively turn its plans into power, and that it basically assumes away the possibility of unintended outcomes or mistakes. I'm not saying that happens most of the time, but it happens frequently enough in some of the cases that I look at, including the Venezuela case. Or if you look at Myanmar, like no one predicted what was happening in Myanmar recently, up until recently, like, oh, maybe China orchestrated the latest coup and that it's good for China. Well, it's clearly not as simple as that. So if you have overly simplified realist or whatever perspective views, I do think the realist views are more dominant now, they contribute to bad analysis and bad policy in certain situations. And I see that happening, at least in the US.
And they usually relate their narrative to nationalism and to populism, no? That's why the...
For sure. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's why, I mean, it's so, I think also it's, as you were saying, it's so common to hear about the realist approach right now because it's oversimplified, and it's common that to find it, this argument related to the nationalism or the sovereignism or the populist approach of geopolitics.
Yeah. And
okay,
going back to constructivism, I think the U.S. for the last few years, certain politicians have been in the active process of constructing an enemy, that is China. This is happening in some places in Europe too, and I'm not saying it's completely fabricated. Again, if we look at sort of constructivist theory in its subtlety, I think we can actually find something valuable in that framework. And it's dangerous. It's also common, whether it's from a populist point of view or not. And I think the Biden administration is playing with fire in some ways in continuing some of the policies of the Trump administration by basically saying, well, why is it that the United States needs to have this new green infrastructure policy? Well, it's because if the United States doesn't do it, then China will capture those markets, and it will just further support China's efforts at global domination. So there's a lot of ways in which various domestic policies that the Biden administration are pushing are being done in the name of a sort of China threat. And I'm just not sure that's necessary or healthy. And before too long, and we've already seen this in terms of popular opinion in the US and Europe, there's a deterioration in people's views of China, some of which is merited in terms of views of sort of openness, political openness, human rights issues, but some of which is also constructed for domestic purposes, including populist purposes.
Yeah, so you gave, I think, a good definition, playing with fire.
Yeah, and I think both the U.S. and Europe, I mean, I think the question has to be, well, what is the nature of the problem that both the U.S. and the EU and UK have identified with China? What is potentially changeable? What is not? And I just think we haven't gone nearly far enough in asking some of these questions. And in the meantime, the politicians have moved forward.
That's true. So we are moving towards the end of our talk. I ask you if there is anything else you would like to discuss with us, or let's see if there are some questions from the audience. What do you think?
I just want to congratulate Italy on Eurovision.
Even despite the scandal, there was a scandal.
Oh, I don't know about the scandal. Oh, all right. I got to learn about the scandal. I'm curious if Eurovision has a big audience in China.
We can see that. So thank you. I don't see any other questions. It has been great. Thank you, Matt, for sharing your thoughts and research Hope we can talk soon about new important discoveries, and we hope this talk has been useful in order to better understand the complex evolution of superpowers and geopolitics. So thank you again, Matt.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks.
Thank you also to everyone.
Have a good evening.
Have a great evening. Bye.
All right. Bye.